So welcome to the first episode of the Scullery Department, a new podcast about contemporary politics in South Africa. For now, we're on YouTube and Facebook, but we'll also set up home on podcast apps. I'm Sean Jacobs, and with me are my co-hosts, Judith February and Ebrahim Fakir.
Hi.
Hello.
They speak, okay. So since this is our first episode, let's get some introductions, just basic stuff about this program out the way. So what is the name of this program? Because people are like, what the hell is the Scullery Department? I'm going to take responsibility for that. I went back to Abdullah Ebrahim for inspiration. Of course, you know I do. For those unfamiliar with Mr. Ebrahim, he's arguably South Africa's greatest musician of the 20th century. I don't think Judith or Ebrahim is convinced by that claim. And one of its most successful cultural, specifically musical exports. In fact, Nelson Mandela referred to Ebrahim as, quote, our Mozart. I know that some young people are gonna be like, we shouldn't be judged by like whether we are close to Mozart, but we'll take that win. So picking a title for me was a toss-up between Stream of Consciousness and Scullery Department. The first was the name of a duo album that Abdullah Ebrahim made with the drummer Max Roach, who lived not far from where I'm currently based. And the second was the last tune from the first album of the Jazz Pistols. If you've forgotten who that was, that kick-ass band was making waves in the late 1950s and early 1960s before most of them left South Africa. Remember the names? Kipu Maketse, he didn't leave, but he sadly died in the 1970s. Makai and Soko, Yuma Sekela, Johnny Diani, and the band leader, Abdullah Ebrahim. So I felt Scullery Department was the best suggestion, and I bullied Ebrahim and Judith into accepting it. It's worth quoting how the South African jazz writer Gwen Ansell described the origin of the song title in an interview with the American public radio station NPR. And basically she said that Kipu Maketse, if you remember, he's a sax player, he composed the song, and he once told her that it refers to the situation of musicians who were good enough to play for white patrons in a restaurant, but were only allowed to eat and sit in the scullery or the back kitchen. And I know, Judith, you looked up the definition.
Yeah, well, hi everyone. So yes, I looked up the definition of Scullery Department, of Scullery, but not before you had sent me the link, Sean. But I actually did know what it was before. But I thought it was interesting because it's the place in the kitchen, it's the part where the messy work is done when you're preparing for cooking. And if you really want to look at the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition, it says a room for cleaning and storing dishes and cooking utensils and for doing messy kitchen work. So I think some of what we're going to be doing here is going to be a kind of messy wrestling with issues. But it also reminded me, and I think you convinced both me and Ebrahim about the title. It will maybe be the last time that you bully us into anything. But it also reminded me of my mother was a kitchen girl, my father was a garden boy. That's why I'm a communist. So I quite liked the sort of reference to kitchen in there as well, and scullery and so on.
The other part. Go ahead, Brian.
For me, that was a natural fit, given that I'm always serving and cleaning.
Mostly when you're not in a jacket.
Anyway, so the other thing that we also have to just quickly settle is like, why the hell are the three of us doing this? And again, Judith, if you just want to take us back, like if you want to tell people like, how do we know each other? Like what is the story of just us doing this?
So the three of us, unbelievably, worked together for the former Institute for Democracy in South Africa, IDASA. Some of you who've been around long enough will remember it, in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And that organization, which closed down sadly after 27 years, I was one of the last people to turn off its lights, while the other two on this podcast were doing other things. But we did a lot of groundbreaking work on institution buildings, on democracy, raw politics, which is how I got to learn so much from these two, and also political economy, political parties, but doing work on thorny governance issues from HIV/AIDS, the arms deal, electoral reform, the land question, party funding, media, politics, and so on. And the three of us were very much a part of it. And that's where many of our conversations started. They were always interesting, and we disagreed, but never in a way which threatened our friendships. So despite having moved on, we've all moved on to different careers and experiences and have had shifting ambitions. But we've retained, I think, an abiding interest in a commitment to a better politics, a more functional government here in South Africa, but also better politics around the world, a fairer economy and more decent societies. And so we do this the only way we know how, by thinking and talking, arguing. And I think it is quite interesting and fun that years later, although we're based in three different cities, I'm in Cape Town, Ebrahim's in Johannesburg, and Sean's in New York City. But we bring those diverse experiences and different insights to our shared passion in politics, the economy, and society. And so we thought we'd make this podcast happen. So what can you expect? It won't be crossfire, it won't be formal, and it will definitely not be boring. And if it is, you'll tell us. But it also helps that we know each other really well. And so before we start, a little bit about ourselves. So I'm a lapsed lawyer. I'm a lover of words, a Jill of all trades, and I have more than a passing interest in sport, having, some might say, unbelievably served on the Cricket South Africa board to rescue it from capture, and also the classics. Sean will rib me about that later. And I do write for the Daily Maverick in South Africa, and I also once wrote a book. Ebrahim, your turn.
I unfortunately haven't written a book yet. Yes. But my work does try to kind of straddle stuff in the media, a little bit of academia, and some programs in politics and economics in civil society, largely focused on doing capacity building and training, some research and some publication. Of course, I have some interest, or special interest at least, in elections, and I'm currently a director at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, certainly nowhere as lofty as where Sean currently is.
You know, I'm not gonna talk about lofty stuff or make fun of the classics, because I started this thing by saying Abdullah Ibrahim is like Mozart, which is not. Yeah. Which one to endear me in some quarters. So, like everybody else says, I'm originally from Cape Town. I grew up there, but I now live in New York City. I've lived here for the last 20 years. I can't believe it's been that long. My day job is I'm an associate professor of international affairs at the New School, which is in New York. If you don't know the New School, it's like Hannah Arendt was there, Belafonte, James Baldwin, etc. And I'm also the founder editor of a very small website called Africa is a Country. So with that, we've now introduced ourselves. So quickly, we're gonna try this thing, which I'm hoping we'll do at the beginning of every program, just because to show people we're not just kind of boring. We were talking at the beginning of how I try to dress like an aging hip hop fan. But let's just say quickly in like 1 or 2 minutes, anything that we've seen or read about recently that we'd like to recommend to people who are listening to this or watching this, something that made you look twice. Why don't we start with you, Ebrahim?
Well, it hasn't made me look twice, but it is something I've returned to. It's something old, but, you know, like you, it's not terribly fashionable at the moment to read the kind of stuff I've been looking at. So I've actually been looking at Charles van Onselen's old book called New Babylon, New Nineveh. And this is largely because, you know, you're thinking about the zamazamas and illegal mining at the moment. But you're also thinking about the nexus of corruption, the clergy, state formation, and this kind of commodious relationship between government and capital. And where did it all begin? You know, in a city like Johannesburg, particularly how it's interspersed with crime and so on. So I'm finding it fascinating. And there's a line I just read last night about a local clergy, this is at the turn of the century in the 1900s, who's writing to his people back then, and they're having a debate about prohibition. And he speaks about saying, the mine workers, particularly those who come from the north, and is referring here to the Mozambicans, which brings us to the question of how multicultural South Africa and Johannesburg particularly is, and says, listen, these guys are used to drink. It's a source of comfort. Depriving them would in fact be a harm. So I mean, yeah, I know it's not terribly fashionable to kind of read this social history, particularly not from a guy like Charles van Onselen, but I'm finding it instructive. It's fascinating.
No, it's brilliant. Another program in future, I think we should talk about the Zamas, because I'm having conflicted sort of feelings about them. I saw the Sunday Times in South Africa ran an expose about how they linked up with politics in Lesotho, electoral politics, but also strong arming, commercial mining. But I think you're onto something there about kind of the foundations or the political economy of mining in South Africa, the borders of legal, illegal, like how that plays out in the modern state. So we're going to come back to that. Judith, what's something you kind of looked at?
Well, that intervention by Ebrahim, I think that was fascinating, because sometimes, just to comment on that, sometimes we seem to think that our problems or the challenges of today, we look at it in a very ahistorical way. So, oh my goodness, Zamas have suddenly come out of nowhere, and here they are threatening us. And actually, there's a long history, and we tend to not focus on that. As you say, it's become unfashionable almost to read. So I find that a really interesting, and it would be good to explore that more. But I was mine is not so much something that I've read, but more just a focus. I was thinking about the Steve Biko quote. Yesterday was the anniversary of his death. And his quote, which I think also ties to maybe some of what you said, which he says, in time we'll be in a position to bestow on South Africa the greatest possible gift, a more human face. And when I look at the government and the way in which it acts towards those who are on the margins of society, the policies, for example, there's a big debate on dealing with unemployment, also on the basic income grant, for example, how to deal with the social relief distress grants. And you look at the way in which issues of housing, and it is, how do we put on the society a more human face, where policy actually connects with people, with what they need and what they want to live a decent life, which is at the heart of our Constitution. And I think there's a lot to ponder there. But then the second point I want to make, or maybe the third, is just also a piece that I read this morning by Mark Hayward on Daily Maverick. And I think it is a challenge to us about, the kind of activism that we need to take our country out of this quagmire, cesspit, whatever you want to call it. And, he asks, where are the church leaders? Where are the union leaders? Where are the academics, the thought leaders, the artists, the poets, the dancers, business, young people, women? And it's a challenge, I think. And I'm sure that in some of our conversations on this podcast, we'll be talking about that and how are we going to make a new alternative kind of politics? And there's a lot of work to be done in terms of thinking about that, because there's a tendency to be quite sloppy about it.
You both are just setting the bar really high. Mine is
Sean.
If you can see a book, I'm going to put it on the screen. Oh, there it is. So I'm currently reading this, which I'm obsessed currently with family, kind of more with like personal history, family history, trying to figure some of that stuff out. And a book that I'm liking about how do you think or write about you as a person, and kind of moving in and out between the person and the sort of broader societal, political, economic currents. And this is a book by an Irish writer called Fintan O'Toole. It's called We Don't Know Ourselves, A Personal History of Modern Ireland. I'm looking for that kind of history by a Black South African that I don't think exists. I think what we've had in South Africa is we had all that writing by mostly white South Africans, the writing of loss, the writing of something is over. Even in novels, I think The Promise, this new novel that Galgut wrote. For Black South Africans, you've seen that aspirant literature, the kind of like up from slavery, like what people in America call up from slavery. We're going to make it, or we made it, or we're making it. The novels are all about that this kind of moving to middle class. What we don't have, I think, still is that kind of story that is a lot of these kind of working class stories, the stories of the state, the stories of our relationship to the state. And I'm really enjoying reading this book currently. So anyway, I think that's going to become a feature of our programming, is that we'll always try and throw out something that we like. But in any case, we want to start. Well, I'm in sort of charge for today's program. Don't worry, it's not going to be me every time. This is just me today. So Judith is making a face because she doesn't believe this, because at Edasa I used to bully people. Let's move on.
But I said that was the last time you were bullying us. By the way, can I just come in? I just want to say that Fintan O'Toole is fabulous. And he's also, I heard him talk once in DC on Brexit. And I mean, he is that kind of quintessential writer. So a great recommendation. Anyway,
great choice. So let's get to today's program. I thought the best way to start off a new podcast is to talk about who we are. And this is now we're moving away from my kind of like family story that I was bringing up for this a book or topic that I'm currently sort of obsessed with. We want to talk about South African identity, who's in, who's out. The frame in South Africa, if you go to South Africa right now, it's all about xenophobia. Some people call it Afrophobia, some people call it, some people say it's about foreigners, but it's really this idea of in who can be a member of the South African polity, the post-apartheid polity. What we know is that since the early 2000s, every few years, like clockwork, you have these orgies of violence in South Africa, and it is mostly aimed at black immigrants, black refugees from the rest of Africa who are in South Africa. One of the usual explanations for this kind of violence, these attitudes that are now widespread, they're also now organized, Operation Duduza, political parties that like talk this language to get votes. One of the usual explanations about them is that it's about poverty. It's about a mad scramble at the bottom for resources. But I'm going to ask the two of you, I'm just going to put this to the two of you. Isn't the truth that South Africans, so you disagree with me then, are broadly xenophobic, that it can't be just poverty, and that these ideas are quite widespread? Judith, why don't we start with you?
Well, I thought we would start with Ebrahim, because I want to talk a little bit about the poverty issues, because I think that, so maybe you'd like to go first and then I can segue into that. We've lost him for a minute. No. Maybe while he's okay.
Kind of figuring it out again. Go ahead.
Are we going to get him back?
I was just we're going to get him back. Don't worry. Technical problems are always, now I know you know this, you have a lot of experience with broadcasting. I sound like I'm mansplaining this, but we keep calm and carry on.
But sure, so we keep calm and carry on, right? Since it is the week of the Queen's death, we will follow the British line of keeping calm and carry on. I was deferring to you before you got lost.
No, Judith was suggesting, Ebrahim, that perhaps you wanted to start and then she could come in.
So the joys of living in South Africa, Sean, we were just load shedding, so I had to obviously move off and reconnect on a different device. But regardless, I think I missed the question. What were we talking about?
So basically, what I was saying at the end of my kind of sort of just laying out the topic was to say, normally what people do when these orgies of violence, and especially now also in South Africa, Operation Duduza, is that the name of it? Dudula, and also how politicians appeal, who politicians, when we see on TV, like who's at the marches and so on, the idea is that this is all about poverty. This is at the bottom end of the society. There are these mad scramble for limited resources between people who are all living very hard. And so the explanation is, it is poverty. This is why there's xenophobia. I'm suggesting that these attitudes in South Africa are pretty widespread, and that South Africans are broadly xenophobic. Is that a non-controversial thing to say, or what do you say to that?
No, I would say it is, and I would disagree with you, sort of fairly vehemently. I mean, look, I think there's an aspect of this which is about a scramble for resources at the bottom rung of society, right? But South African society is generally antagonistic. There are all kinds of cleavages and there are all kinds of social antagonisms across different identities, races, primarily, obviously, race being the biggest fault line. But we've never had the kind of cleavage expressing itself in extreme violence. Some people may sort of theorize, like Johnny Steinberg, that some aspects of crime may have been about the unresolved race relations, particularly during the transition and immediately afterwards, right? So there is that aspect, and the antagonisms are deep, and so it's unsurprising that one of the antagonisms would be against people who are perceived to be foreigners. So there's an element of truth to the fact that there's a scramble at the bottom. There's also an element of truth to the fact that there are deep antagonisms, and foreigners or people perceived to be foreigners would be directly in the line of fire. What I'm not in accord with is the idea that South Africa is just generally xenophobic, because it's not. I mean, you've had waves of migration into the country. People have generally been accepted. There's been a new mood that people of different identities, different races, so I'm using identity as a proxy for race, are part of the South African identity, right? So to use the old sort of terminology which we want to try and get away from, but we have to invoke it here, unfortunately, is the kind of Indian, African, colored, the white, colored, and Indian are viewed as South African. I'm not talking about the new Indian migrants coming from Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, wherever. But there's an acceptance that they are part of South. They are part
Their
of the South African.
existence is not in question. They're just sort of like underscore. Yeah, nobody questions.
Yeah, the existence is not in question as a South African. So they're part of the political community. But by and large, I mean, just the thing I started off speaking about the mine workers in early Johannesburg. Many of them were non-South African. At that time, I mean, it was turn of the century. 1910 comes the Union of South Africa. But Mozambique, what we currently call Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Swaziland, to a small degree Botswana, to a small degree Zambia and elsewhere, were all having mine workers, including Malawi, right? Had mine workers working here who coexisted in the townships, and things were not as extreme as they are now. So I don't think South Africans are by definition xenophobic. I also don't agree that much of what is currently passing is in fact xenophobia. And there's a reason why I say so. I know both of you, being as progressive as you are going to disagree with me, and that's fine. But I think Operation Dudula in particular initially got some bad press. And I think it was terribly unfair, because they weren't necessarily saying we don't want any foreigners. They were pointing to two problems. A, lax border controls and poor government and poor governance at the borders, at Home Affairs, through the regularization processes of people through getting visas, asylum, refugee papers, whatever the case might be. So they're talking about lax policing at the borders, and they're talking about irregular government in Home Affairs. So that was their first gripe. The second gripe was that because of the first failure, there's just a whole lot of people who are here illegally, who are here undocumented. They can't be traced. There's no documentation or identity, yet they're living in our midst. And they are a tax on the resources, on public resources especially. So I'm not surprised that people would have that antagonism, because they are competing at that level. So these guys who come in are not competing in the formal economy. They're all competing in the informal economy. And the mass of South Africans, located as they are because of our history, but also because of the last 25, 27 years of extremely poor government and contradictory policy, are also scrambling because they don't have the skills to enter the formal market. You've got the shrinking economy. The market is smaller. You have a decade of state capture, and suddenly the formality is receding and informality is becoming a greater portion of the economy. So inevitably, they're going to be competing at that level. Now, I know some of you are going to point out and say, no, but what about 1998? There were kind of pogroms emerging then. There was 2002 on the brink of Mbeki's presidency for the second time. There was another spurt. Things were looking good then. On the contrary, things weren't looking good. The economy was not in the great shape that everyone claimed it was, and levels of informality were extremely high. So I'm not surprised that this happens, and I'm also not prepared to simply say these are people who are being xenophobic and hateful. I think they're genuine and real grievances about resources, but also about the poor state of government and the poor state of policing, especially because the police, in kind of not doing what they're supposed to do, have one failure, and they have a second failure which they compound by accepting bribes and allowing some of the guys who are here illegally and undocumented to get away with doing some of the crap that they do. And you can't run away from the fact that they are engaged in certain activities which are completely antisocial.
So let me, just to cut into you on your comment about Dudula. I'm going to get this right. Clearly, I'm sitting in Brooklyn too much. You were saying that Dudula got bad press, and the sort of construction of why Dudula got, what Dudula thought was the problem. So there's a recent article I read by Savo Veleta, who is I think we've lost Ebrahim again. He's a researcher out of the Nelson Mandela University, where, he's back. Okay. It's good that we have this so people can see that this is done, that this is the context, this is the
load shedding.
Load shedding, lack of electricity, which, by the way, again, South Africa is not exceptional in that, but South Africa, for an industrialized country, or an industrializing country, and one of the biggest economies in Africa, to have this kind of access to electricity, to energy, you could see the effect in like real time. But I'm just, Ebrahim, what I was just saying was this argument that with Savo Veleta, in an article, Savo Veleta is a researcher out of the Eastern Cape, points out that there is what Dudula would say is that there are all these foreigners coming into South Africa. They undermine the country's security, stability, and prosperity. But if you look at the census, South Africa is not overwhelmed with migrants. They are at best about 4% of the population. The last Stats South Africa in 2016, which is the last time they measured this stuff, said that foreign-born people in South Africa stood at 1.6 million. That is out of a population at that time of 55 million. And just the last part, which I think Roundup was reporting on, that the majority of foreign nationals don't receive any support from the government, such as social grants, and that they have to fend for themselves for survival. So this idea that they are like a drain on the country's resources, that they are the majority of the people that participate in crime. It's like crime sort of was invented now by Zimbabweans and so on. I'm not saying you're saying that, but I'm saying to you that's what I know what Dudula is saying. Can you just respond to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's what Dudula was saying. That was what people were reporting Dudula to have said, but may not in fact have been what Dudula was saying. I still think Dudula was originally, they obviously shifted from
fair point.
But they started off saying two very basic things. A, there's lax border policing, and two, there are major problems at Home Affairs at levels of corruption and regularization of people who should not be regularized. The second is that even though, and we can talk about aggregate statistics all we like, the fact of the matter is that even if it's 3%, Sean, if you are competing with that 3%, however small, however minuscule that number is, if you're competing with those people at the base of society in the informal economy, they are your threat, irrespective of the fact that you are competing along with other South Africans for the same scarce resources. Now, whether they are receiving government grants or not is immaterial because they are not a drain on those resources. That's obvious. But it's undeniable that they are a drain when they go to local clinics, when they go to local health facilities, when they compete for the same menial jobs, whether it be in domestic work, whether it be as service in restaurants, or whether it be as cleaners. So at those two levels, they are. Third is whether they populate informal settlements or the lower reaches of formal townships, whether they are backyarders or whether they are going to be in the inner cities, cramming buildings and so on. They are taxing public resources in using basic services, electricity. There's safety hazards. There's no regulation of many of the buildings in which they're occupying, and those.
But is that their fault? I know Judith is like ready to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm ready to speak. Amazing, guys. So I mean, I think that a lot of these. So it's this thing about, you know, one can hold two thoughts at once, and two things can be true at once, and many things here. So just if we look at the latest, to me it feels like we're in a perfect storm, right? We've had 10 years of state capture, not to repeat the points, but we also have a youth unemployment rate, which, you know, in any other country we'd be, I don't know, it's a tremendous crisis. We carry on as if it's all good. 63.9% for 15 to 24-year-olds, 42% for 25 to 34-year-olds. And you talked about the past and the way we've kind of dealt with it. I mean, 2008, even the Burning Man, you know, who we can't forget those pictures of that kind of xenophobia. So I think that, you know, it's a mixture of all these factors with regard and increasing inequality and so on, but also I think a lack of leadership. And of course, this again goes back to the fact that our politics is falling apart. Because if you have a situation where you do have the access to scarce resources, but you've had 10 years of capture, and you're perfectly right, the police, all of these things play a substantial role in increasing attitudes of hatred towards things that are people that are other. And that's, I mean, the meaning of the word xenophobia. But I want to come back to an article that it was David Lewis who wrote it. I don't know if you guys saw it in Business Day, where he talks about he talks about.
It's for people who don't know who's people listening to this and they don't know who David Lewis is.
Yeah, so David Lewis used to be the head of Corruption Watch, but he's also a former trade unionist and an academic, and also I think was on the Competition Commission, if I'm not mistaken. But he talks about the need for proper leadership, for proper policy, and that we haven't really had that conversation because everything is so confused. And I think the other important point to make is that we're not the only people who are struggling with this, because if you look at the Priti Patel in the UK, the issues around Rwanda, dealing with people coming in illegally via Rwanda, and also in the United States, Sean, I mean, building a wall, it's one of the global hotbed issues. And so I think the second last point I want to make is around just around the use of language and the way in which our politicians, so if you listen to somebody like Papi Ramatuba, who's the Limpopo MEC for Health, and her lambasting this Zimbabwean woman at her bedside, and the kind of language that is used, the kind of violence of language, which is visited upon the foreigner, the other, and taking all of our problems and putting it into these individuals. And there's something for me about the discourse, which I think politicians and leaders have the responsibility to deal with in a way which is constructive. But at a moment where you've had a leadership collapse as well, where things fall apart, you don't have that. And so into this vacuum comes Dudula, comes everything, comes every problem we have, and we put it in there and we blame somebody else. But the last point, so David Lewis in this article, he talks about a paper in 2021 by somebody called Kangalani Moyo from the Migration Information Service. And he cites, it says, official estimates of 2.9 million migrants in South Africa, Most are from SADC, the Southern African Development Community, and most are here illegally. And what Lewis is saying is, look, we need to have some sort of a better system with regard to perhaps within SADC about how to deal with people who are coming in and what rights they do have. The point for me is that it is about asking a more primary question, is what kind of society do we want? A society based on Ubuntu, which is a constitutional value. It might be unfashionable now to talk about the Constitution, but it is our founding document. And for better or worse, the values that we agreed upon, which is coming right up against, and I'm sure this podcast will talk about it, it's coming right up against the kind of inequality and the day-to-day struggles of people. And then the question is, what does this constitution even mean? But a society which is based fundamentally on decency. And I think that we are becoming an increasingly indecent society in many more ways than we were before, race and class and so on. And so I do think that we need to, the question, Sean, your Fintan O'Toole point about we don't know ourselves. So the question is, as you preface the conversation, is who are we? Are we these violent, bloody individuals who go seeking out, torching people in their homes? Or do we want to sort of, in these ungentle times, do we want to be better? But can we be better given the scarce resources that we have?
So I wanna suggest another way to think about this, and I've said this in many different forums, but I'm going to try and I'll make it short. Basically, and I take this. I'm borrowing a little bit from Sosonke Msimang. I have my own spin on it, but this is something that we've talked about before. That one of the sort of at a sort of existential level, if you kind of figuring out like what does it mean to be a South African, is that there is consensus among most South Africans, and this goes back to Ebrahim's point about who can belong, and that there is no question about who are the different groups, who has a claim to South Africanness. So there's a consensus about the boundaries of South Africanness, and essentially it means that Black and white South Africans, they have Sosonke's point that they have a kinship that is based not on blood or anything, but on their shared experience of colonialism and apartheid. And then in South Africa, foreigners, in this kind of thinking, foreigners are foreign because they cannot understand the pain of apartheid, because all South Africans of those four different categories, white, and we're using those old categories now, colored, Indian, and Black, right? They all are victims of that system, whether they all live through the trauma of apartheid, and it's a defining experience for all of them it made a nation out of them. Because, this new nation wasn't formed by blood. This new nation, if it was formed by blood, then it's Afrikaners, right? And we know that was an exclusionary notion of the nation. It's not ethno-nationalism, which is like, if you want Zulu nationalism, it had to be something else. So it's this collective history of suffering that binds these people together. Whether you meted out the suffering or whether you suffered, you are part of this nation. The problem is that story ended, that story of collective participation in that history of suffering and exploitation ended. And we could debate about formally when that ended. Was it 1990 or was it 1994? But it did end that moment. So only those people that were here for the suffering, they can claim the right to South Africanness. Everybody else who comes after that, they cannot be South African. I mean, there's this kind of, for me, I think it's similar to like Northern Europe, where you can never really be Swedish or Danish, like in those Scandinavian countries. You can have a passport, but they will tell you what a Danish person is. They'll tell you what Danish culture is. And for South Africans, there's an unwillingness to like expand the boundaries of what it means to be South African. And especially, you could be an immigrant from Eastern Europe and you could be South African, but you cannot be an immigrant from other Southern African countries. And when Ebrahim was setting up his point, what's bizarre is like that Southern Africa, or even South and Central Africa, as Ebrahim said, is as much implicated in the founding of this place that we now call South Africa, whether it is through labor, farming, mining, even the struggle, like and again, people was like, why do you bring up the struggle? Like, not just housing South Africans, but paying a price for apartheid, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Mozambique. And I'll finish with this last part. So the point is here, in that construction, these people can never become citizens. Now, there are exceptions sometimes. When I was watching the World Athletic Championships the other day, I spotted some kids who I was like, oh, I Googled them, and they were like the son of a Ghanaian UN worker who ends up in Pretoria, and now this kid is running for South Africa in the athletics. Or there was the beautiful case of the Congolese refugee, young Congolese refugee who played soccer in Cape Town in these kind of colored football clubs, ends up representing Banyana in the World Cup in France. So there was this like kid of Congolese refugees at the heart of South Africa's midfield, and that was beautiful to watch. And here's the last part. So with that thing of like the boundaries of South Africanness, the other part that I think is interesting is that the anti-apartheid project, so if there's this notion of collective trauma, the other part was the anti-apartheid project was framed also in nationalist terms. Despite all that story I told you about, like, and Ebrahim said also about the miners' strikes, the workers from Lesotho, the Zamazamas are returning, right? So I'm not saying they were all Zamazamas, but there's a longer history about Lesotho migrant workers. So the last point is that project was framed in nationalist terms, and that nationalist project promised you liberation from poverty, racism, exclusion, and inequality. But that hasn't happened since 94. And all you got was exclusion or whatever. And all that I can offer you now, the ANC, sometimes even the EFF, all the parties, particularly now the parties of the majority of Black people, I can just offer people chauvinism. They can just offer people exclusion. Is that a reasonable take?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. But I mean, you're also going to have parties which are going to flip-flop, right? And they're going to make and say things which are convenient at a particular moment in time. So some will be completely anti-xenophobic at some points, and yet the very next week, they're going to inspect restaurants to see whether they have foreign workers, etc. So parties are never, and I would take their word must be the last word. But I think what we have here is we're talking about slightly different things, right? So let's just de-aggregate it. Sean, the thing you're talking about is something about the imagination and the cosmology of identity. Like who's going to make up this agglomeration called South African? And on one level, there's the shared aspect of colonialism, oppression, apartheid, marginalization, exclusion that binds us together. That we share the place together with
but
whites.
Who's sharing that?
So here's but here's the thing, right? We share, so it's the blacks who share that. But what do we share with the whites? We share with whites the fact that it's a colonialism, and to use the archaic language of the ANC, it's colonialism of a special type. They occupied the same place. They didn't flee. They want to be here. So we found some accommodation. And you made the point that there are people who've been accommodated, who in the cosmology of South African identity happen to find themselves either being an athlete or a professional or a writer or whatever, who's absorbed into the South African experience, even though they might not share the same history or the same kind of cultural attributes, but they've been accepted. Where the issues have come about, and this is where the conflation has happened, is that in a regulated, governmentalized sense, this thing doesn't work. I can't walk in to visit you where you are, Sean. Well, other than the prohibitively expensive cost, which we need not go into. But I can't walk into the US, right? I mean, I have to go through a whole series of hoops to be able to get there. I can't, even if I got there, I can't access public health care anywhere else in the world, Judith. So I mean, irrespective of what our constitution says, and no matter how humane we want to be in a regulatory, legal sense, that stuff is impossible for me. As humane as a society you may want to wish to hold up as an example, take Germany, take any part of Europe. It's impossible for anyone to go there, access healthcare, use their services, and so on.
Do we?
Sorry, Sean, I completely agree with that. So I don't want to be seen. And I think part of what that MEC in Limpopo said, she said the people who are complaining about this are the middle-class commentators who have access to medical aid, who are complaining about my comments, which is a cheap shot at all of us, I guess, on this podcast and others, who it's comfortable for us to say, the person should be looked after. But of course, that's the case. But I think what we're saying is we want a viable policy. And of course, not everybody can come in and simply, use the services. So I'm certainly not making the argument when I say we need to be decent. I'm not making the argument for no rules and for a kind of laissez-faire policy. But just the opportunism of the politicians like Herman Mashaba, Gayton McKenzie. I mean, I'm astounded that we're holding up Gayton McKenzie as an example of, given his background and given the comments that he's made. But people find, it finds resonance, and the media play a role in that as well. But so there's that electoral opportunism because we're also in that time. Just the last point, Sean, about sports people. I mean, Tendai Mtawarira, the beast in rugby, who could have been more beloved? Somebody who was welcomed and who in fact got a sort of, very easy ride into South Africa when they wanted to stop his being able to play for the Springboks. But Home Affairs quickly sorted that out because we needed him in the rugby team. So there's that kind of schism. But I suspect you'll find that all over the world. You find it in the English cricket teams, in rugby teams, and so on, and football, no doubt.
Again, I'm not saying I want to quickly for myself make this point. South Africa is not exceptional in this stuff.
Yeah,
we cannot pretend like South Africa is somehow this terrible place, because a lot of the journalism about South Africa also will paint this as like the disappointment of this country had this like great idea of itself, and then without that sort of history that I was kind of laying out, this history of like, and what Ebrahim contrasts is like the Black South Africans had a sense of how to understand this future. And then they had to understand their relationship with white South Africans. And again, there you mean Black collectively. I want to make this point that I'm not thinking South Africa is exceptional in this. South Africa this is a post-colonial problem. This question of drawing borders and then making rules, and all governments are then forced to like live with those rules and to implement those rules and to operate within world systems that are not as nice as you would want to be. Those Ebrahim's point about, can I come to you just to New York tomorrow and fly in? That's not gonna happen. You have to go queue at the American consulate in far away from the big city. You need a car to get there because there's no public transport out to those places, by the way, just to like make this a footnote. But you could go back to the early 1980s with what happened with Nigeria, and how Nigeria told Ghanaians that they needed to get out of Nigeria. That famous phrase that people say, Ghana must go, with those bags with the stripes? That was at that time the Nigerian military. Buhari, I think it was Buhari, who's the current president, said that Ghanaians must get out of Nigeria. If you look at like Cote d'Ivoire, which everybody loves, Ouattara, who's not anymore because he broke the constitution. In that country also, they had a thing where the previous president, Gbagbo, he came up with this idea of what he called Ivorité. And basically it was an idea of like only certain people could be Ivorian. If you are the descendant of long histories of migrations between Cote d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso, you could not, even Ouattara, because he was considered, his family came from Burkina Faso. So South Africa is not unique in this. Zimbabwe and its relationship with Malawians, Botswana and its relationship with people from its northern part that it considers those people must be from Zimbabwe, they can't be from Botswana. These things are not just the problem of South Africa. In fact, and I was going to say this earlier, there's research that shows there are high levels of kind of antipathy or hatred of foreigners in the whole region. South Africa is not unique in this. What I think, and I'm not appealing to this like, oh, we were a rainbow and therefore we are a rainbow. That's what I meant by like that kind of writing about South Africa. I think what I'm hoping for in South Africa is like, how is it that such a group of people that is a really small part of the population that formally is not really a burden on the state. Now, Ebrahim, I get your point. Like there is this competition in that place of informality, but formally they're not a burden on the public, necessarily on the public purse. I know with the minister, with her like showing off in the hospital crudely. This is also about the failing of the South African government towards its actual citizens. And now it's just fashionable to pick on a group of people that are just easy to pick on. And again, there South Africa is no different. Trump, Biden,
No.
in the US, everybody pulls it. The horrible case of Patel and the Conservatives in Britain too.
Yeah. And also, I mean, it's the political opportunism. So you don't want to confront the fact that your health system is failing without the help of foreigners. Let's be clear, and that everything else is falling apart. You have bridges collapsing. I mean, we don't have to do the litany of things that are falling apart. We sit here in the middle of load shedding. So, and Sean, your point about South Africa not being exceptional is exactly right. But I think it's the opportunism. So for me, it's a toxic mix, and it's almost like we need calm heads at the moment, but we don't get it from the politicians. We're not getting it because the discourse is muddled. And so I watched a program on ENCA, which is the local channel here, with Dan Moyani, and it was on policing, but it ended up being about immigration. There was somebody there from Operation Dudula, etc., Soweto Parliament. I mean, their view was it's the foreigners who are responsible for crime. They're bribing the police. It was just this kind of appalling. There was almost, but I think the program, the show was also lopsided. So all you got was just this 2 hours of vitriol against foreigners. And we don't look at ourselves and go, we also have a problem, right? And what are we doing about that? And then the Deputy National Commissioner of Police was on this program with no solutions to offer, nothing, just weak, couldn't really have been bothered. And so I think it's that, what we're appealing for is a kind of a better discourse, but it's hard in the milieu that we're in, I think.
Ebrahim, do you want to go quickly? Because I know we're close to time.
Yeah, I want to come back to an early point I made. I think it's quite clear to begin to sort of end to where we began, that this is about government failure. And I think I was quite clear about that fact. But insofar as it is about government failure, we can't, on the other hand, also caricature their position. So I think it's fair game to criticize the MEC, Ramatuba, who kind of victimized the Zimbabwean patient. But let me put this question to you guys. That patient was treated, right? She was badly treated by the minister, but she got the health treatment that she required. She was given an operation. I don't think there's anywhere else in the world where that would have happened for an undocumented migrant who's out of any formal net, who has no papers, and is completely informal as a person.
You can get that in a U.S. city, in like a so-called sanctuary city in the U.S. One's run by Democrats. You can get that.
Also,
well, it's fairly rare.
I mean, my question is, did the MEC, you say like in the end she did get the care, fair play. So why did the MEC? Why did she need to do that when it?
Well, that's the opportunity.
That's the politicking. That's the thing
exactly that we're all criticizing. So we know that the politicians are awful. We know that we've got probably the worst of the pick across the board, across all parties, right? But if we keep hankering after the fact that we've got the lowest common denominator type politics, or using popular issues and coming up with populist measures to address the popular issues, whether it be crime, whether it be land, whether it be unemployment, whatever, there's a whole bunch of populism. I don't think we need to focus on the politicians. I think we need to look at what's going on in society. And in society, there's a layer at which there's a real difficulty with dealing with two things. A, people who feel that they have to compete with others for the same scarce resources. And second, that they have to contend with massive levels of government failure because they are entirely reliant on government. Us in the middle class can opt out. I can opt out for healthcare, for security, for policing, for transport, even something as basic as that. I can opt out. They can't. They're competing with these same people for services. And for them, it's the government failure. There's the dual track. And I think often the popular discourse ignores the second part of the equation. So it's like, oh, look how bad the rebel is. The rebel is out and they're being xenophobic. But the rebel's actually not complaining as much as they are about foreigners. And Judith, I think you saw that television program, which was probably a partial picture of a more complex reality. I mean, the real target of people's anger is in fact government failure.
Yes. But it's about the way in which that is articulated. But I mean, that's another podcast. And I completely agree with you about the question of politicians, and that we can't, we shouldn't be focusing on them so much. But I strongly believe that words do matter. And so, when you've got an MEC who does that, then you have people outside, I can't remember the hospital in Soweto, stopping people who look like foreigners. One person was from Venda, and he couldn't get in because people were being labeled, you look like a foreigner. Because there is a license from the top. It's kind of like Zuma. If he's starting to loot the state, well, it's fair game to anybody right down to local municipality to do the same. So I do think the words of the powerful, I think it does matter. In the same way as, for example, you have Donald Trump and then you have Biden for whatever his faults, but you kind of just lower the temperature, right? So you don't have as much of that toxic discourse, and it's sending a message to people out there. So, but I don't think we're at odds with what we're saying. I think that it's a kind of emphasis.
I think this is a great way to we don't want to argue ourselves into
Never.
like we're all like in a corner like this. So this is a great way to end this, but it's also like a good kind of indicator of what office politics was like at IDASA, in which we all come from our various different kind of socializations in South Africa, of different kinds of educations, although we have to concede here to our audience that we all went to elite universities, however we came from these different parts of Cape Town and Johannesburg, we all ended up and got good educations there. So we are of a particular kind of class, but I don't want us to like we have lots of arguments at the end when Ebrahim was like, we need to look outside this political class. And I was like, yeah, I'm always excited by if somebody starts talking about social movements, and we have to, and at least, I agree with Ebrahim, you have to like seriously engage with something as it emerges in a place. And in South Africa right now, Black politics, and maybe this could be a program for another time, is moving to the right, I think.
Yeah.
And I think maybe in another point, it might be the next one, we might want to tackle that move. Like what happened here? Like, how is it that a politics, particularly Black politics, that was a politics of kind of liberation movements, traditions of that those traditions were always kind of inclusive. Even if they were nationalists, they were very inclusive, that kind of politics. Whether it is broadly as Black or whether they appeal to a kind of broadline racialism. But these are the kind of things that we could break down in this program and ask kind of hard questions. And as you can see, we're not going to agree. And I like that. I like that about, because I have other spaces in which everybody agrees. So this is great to come back to old roots.
There's going to be very boring spaces.
Yeah, otherwise this will work. So this is a great start. I'm very happy we're doing this. We'll have, when we put this up on YouTube and Facebook, in the description, we may have to set up something like a Substack, which is a little website, just to let people know, this is, or we'll tweet about it to tell them where this. We'll tweet about it for our different Twitter accounts. We'll put that in the description, so people can get a sense of when the next program is going to be. So with that, that's a goodbye from me.
Cheers from
Cheers,
Cape Town.
guys.
Yes.